You never think it's going to happen to you. At least I didn't. For 48 years, I'd lived my life by my own rules, carving out a space in the world that was mine and mine alone. I'm Carl, a retired Army veteran who spent 2 decades serving my country. I've marched through deserts, slept in freezing rain, and faced down situations most people couldn't imagine. And through it all, I kept one thought in my head. Someday, I'd find a quiet place to call my own. A place where no one could tell me what to do. That place became my parents' house, a sturdy little ranch-style home they left to me when they passed. I inherited it in my late 30s, back when my marriage was still intact, and my kids were just finishing high school. It wasn't much to look at back then. Peeling paint, a sagging roof, and an overgrown yard. But it had good bones, and I knew it could be something special. Over the years, I poured my heart and soul into that house. Every nail I drove in, every blade of grass I mowed, and every repair I made was a reflection of who I was. It wasn't just a house. It was my sanctuary, my fortress. I'd fixed the roof myself, rebuilt the deck, and even installed the hardwood floors. You could walk through the place and see my handiwork in every corner. I liked it that way. It felt lived in, personal, like no one else could ever understand its worth the way I did. The house sat on a quiet street in an older neighborhood, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves. It was perfect for me. I wasn't the type to host barbecues or sit out on the porch gossiping with neighbors. I'd wave if I saw someone, sure, but I didn't go out of my way to start conversations. Privacy was my top priority, and for the most part, my neighbors respected that. No one asked too many questions or pushed their way into my business. Sure, we might nod politely while hauling trash bins to the curb or exchange a morning when heading out for the day, but that was about as far as our interactions went. Just the way I liked it. I'd settled into a life of quiet independence. Divorced for almost a decade, my 2 kids, both grown and living in other states, had their own lives. I'd raised them well, and though we didn't see each other often, we stayed in touch. I was proud of them, but I didn't expect them to drop everything to keep tabs on their old man. I wasn't that kind of dad. Besides, I'd always been self-reliant, a trait the Army had drilled into me. You didn't wait for someone to fix your problems. You rolled up your sleeves and got it done yourself. That independence was my pride. I hated bureaucracy, red tape, and rules for the sake of rules. I'd spent too many years being told what to do, where to be, and how to live. Out here, in this house on this quiet street, I was free. No commanding officers, no deadlines, no one breathing down my neck. Just me, my tools, and the satisfaction of a job well done. I thought I had everything figured out. This house, this life. It was my escape from the noise of the world. But life has a funny way of knocking you off balance when you least expect it. I never saw it coming, but all of that changed when the HOA moved in. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. A few years ago, some newer families moved into the neighborhood. Younger folks, mostly with bright ideas about improving the community. One afternoon, I was cleaning up in the garage when a knock came at the door. I grabbed a rag, wiped the dust off my hands, and opened it to find a woman I recognized from a few houses down standing on my porch. She had a clipboard in one hand and an overly bright smile plastered on her face. "Hi there," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "I just wanted to stop by and share something exciting we've been working on for the neighborhood." I raised an eyebrow, already suspicious. "What's that?" "Well," she began, clutching the clipboard a little tighter, "a group of us have been meeting, and we're in the process of starting a homeowners association. It's a great way to keep the neighborhood looking nice and organized. We'd love to have your support." I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed. "A homeowners association? And what's that supposed to do?" "Oh, just some basic rules to keep things tidy," she said, flipping through her clipboard. "Like maintaining lawns, keeping fences in good condition, and making sure everything looks uniform. It's really about improving property values and creating a stronger sense of community." I let out a small chuckle. "And who exactly decided this was a good idea?" "A few of us neighbors have been talking about it," she said, glancing down at the clipboard as if it would back her up. "We've already gotten a lot of signatures. Once we have a majority, we can make it official." "So," I said slowly, You're saying that if enough people sign on, you're going to set rules for everyone? Well, she hesitated, her smile faltering for the first time. It's optional for current homeowners. We're not forcing anyone. But new buyers would be required to follow the HOA's rules and pay dues. Over time, the whole neighborhood would benefit. I gave her a long look. Optional, huh? And what happens if I decide not to join? Oh, nothing at all, she said quickly, her smile snapping back into place. But we're hoping you'll see the benefits. It's really for the good of the community. I nodded, even though I wasn't buying a word of it. Well, I appreciate you letting me know, but I think I'll pass. My house has done just fine without an HOA. Her smile tightened, and she adjusted the clipboard in her hands. If you change your mind, let me know. We'd really love to have everyone involved. Sure thing, I said, already stepping back to close the door. She handed me a brightly colored flyer before turning to leave. The words, "Improving our community together," printed in bold across the top. The idea was to make the neighborhood look more uniform and boost property values. Here's the kicker. They said it was optional for longtime residents like me. Newcomers? Mandatory. That should have been the first red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I skimmed the flyer, chuckled at the mention of monthly dues, and tossed it into the trash. I wasn't about to pay someone to tell me what color I could paint my shutters. A few weeks later, I got another flyer, this one a bit more insistent. Join the HOA and be part of something great. It read. No thanks, I thought. But as time went on, I noticed more and more of my neighbors signing up. Suddenly, the folks who used to just wave at me were inviting me to meetings and telling me about new rules the HOA was putting in place. No parking on the street overnight. Trash bins must be stored out of sight. Yards must be maintained to HOA standards. It was laughable. They had no authority over me. I wasn't a member. But the cracks in our peaceful neighborhood were beginning to show. There were two camps now. The HOA enthusiasts and the holdouts like me. Tension simmered beneath the surface, and it wasn't long before it boiled over. The harassment began subtly at first. They started with warning letters slipped under my door, stamped with the HOA logo at the top. They listed violations on my property. My grass was too long, my fence paint was peeling, and my truck, parked in my driveway, was an eyesore. I ignored them. I wasn't part of their HOA, and I figured they couldn't enforce their ridiculous rules on me. But the letters didn't stop. They became more aggressive, listing fines for so-called violations and demanding immediate compliance. Around this time, something changed. The HOA began talking about enforcement, claiming they had created an officers' team to uphold community standards. The officers appeared shortly after, a group tasked with enforcing HOA rules. They wore matching dark uniforms with the HOA logo stitched on the sleeves, baton-like tools in hand, and walkie-talkies clipped to their belts. It was clearly meant to give them an air of authority, though I couldn't tell if it was all for show or if they actually believed they had real power. Either way, I wasn't about to let them push me around. They came to my house in a group of 5, marching up the driveway like they were on patrol. The leader, a stocky man with a baton in hand and a smug grin on his face, stepped forward. "Mr. Miller," he began, his tone sharp and rehearsed. "We're here to address the violations on your property." I crossed my arms, refusing to move. "I'm not part of your HOA. Your rules don't apply to me." "That's not how it works," he said, smirking. "You live here, so you're subject to our community standards. It's only fair you comply. I've been living here for over 20 years without any of your standards," I replied. "And I don't need them now. So whatever you're here for, the answer's no. Now get off my property." The leader's grin tightened, but he didn't back down. "Your fence is falling apart," he said, gesturing toward it. "That's a safety hazard for the neighborhood. And that window," he pointed at the front of my house, "it's already cracked. Someone could get hurt." "The fence is fine," I snapped. "And the window's not cracked. You're making things up." The leader stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You've got until the end of the week to fix this, or we'll have to take action. This is your final warning." I clenched my fists, standing firm. "You touch my property, And I'll call the cops. He smirked again, clearly enjoying himself. We're just trying to help you, Mr. Miller. It'd be a shame if things got worse. With that, they turned and left, their walkie-talkies crackling as they walked back down the driveway. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I left the house to run errands. By the time I returned, the damage was done. My fence was torn apart. An entire section ripped down, the wood splintered and scattered across the yard. One of my windows was shattered, the glass glinting in the sunlight. Spray painted in bright red across the side of my house were the words, HOA rules, and on my porch, the light fixture was smashed to pieces, shards of glass littering the steps. I stood there for a moment, staring at the destruction, my hands clenching into fists. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a deliberate, calculated attack. I went straight to my security cameras, pulling up the footage. Sure enough, the cameras had caught everything. The same group of HOA officers had come back while I was gone, baton-like tools in hand. The footage showed them tearing down the fence, smashing the window, spray painting the side of my house, and destroying the porch light. They didn't even try to hide it. I called the police immediately. My hands were shaking as I dialed, not from fear, but from the raw anger simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was war. When the officers arrived, I walked them through the destruction, pointing out every detail. The torn-down fence, the graffiti, the smashed porch light, and the shattered glass still glinting in the sunlight. Then I showed them my security footage. The two officers exchanged glances as they watched the video, which clearly showed the 5 HOA officers marching onto my property like they owned it. They hadn't even bothered to cover their faces. The footage caught them tearing down the fence, smashing the window with their batons, spray painting the graffiti, and laughing as they destroyed the porch light. This is clear-cut vandalism and trespassing, one of the officers said. We'll file a report and take this to the district attorney. Good, I said, because I want them held accountable. Within hours, the police had warrants issued for the 5 individuals in the video. It didn't take long to find them. These weren't criminals trying to hide. They were neighbors who'd somehow convinced themselves they were above the law. The officers were arrested at their homes and charged with trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. Watching them being led away in handcuffs didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it would. It wasn't enough. Not yet. News of the arrests spread quickly through the neighborhood. For the first time, the HOA's practices were being openly questioned. I started getting calls from neighbors who'd previously ignored me, asking if it was true, asking what had happened. Some were shocked, insisting they'd had no idea the HOA's officers would take things so far. Others, mostly HOA diehards, whispered about how I'd overreacted, blaming me for bringing the police into what they saw as a community matter. The officers were booked and released on bail, pending their court appearances. It felt surreal knowing the same people who'd smashed my property were now walking free, still living just down the street. But the trial came quickly. I made sure to be there, sitting in the front row as the evidence was laid bare. The prosecutor didn't hold back. The security footage was the star of the show, leaving no room for doubt about who was responsible. The defense tried to argue that the officers had been acting in the interest of the community, but the footage of them spray painting HOA rules on my house made it clear this was about intimidation, not improvement. The verdict came after just a few hours of deliberation. Guilty. Each officer was fined $5,000 and sentenced to 200 hours of community service, mostly focused on local restoration projects. They also received 2 years of probation with strict conditions. No contact with me, regular check-ins, and restrictions on their movements within the neighborhood. The judge didn't stop there. He ordered them to pay $20,000 in restitution for the damage to my property, to be split among the 5 of them. Seeing their smug faces replaced by stunned disbelief gave me a small sense of relief. But it wasn't enough. The HOA as a whole needed to be held accountable, not just these 5 individuals. With the criminal case wrapped up, I turned my attention to the bigger picture. My lawyer and I filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA itself. The goal wasn't just to recover damages. It was to dismantle their system of abuse entirely. We sought $300,000 for property damage, emotional distress, and legal fees, and demanded the immediate disbandment of their officers' team. To build the case, my lawyer compiled everything: the security footage, police reports, the warning letters, and even testimony from neighbors who had witnessed the harassment firsthand. Some of those neighbors, previously silent, came forward to admit they'd felt intimidated by the HOA's officers but had been too afraid to speak up. The HOA, of course, fought back. Their defense was as audacious as it was absurd. They claimed that I had invited their officers onto my property to assist with maintenance, and that their actions had been part of a good-faith effort to help. They painted me as a stubborn, uncooperative neighbor who was resistant to community progress, but the evidence didn't lie. My lawyer dismantled their narrative piece by piece. The security footage showed their officers laughing as they smashed my property, not acting like a team trying to help. Neighbors testified that I'd explicitly told the HOA to stay off my property, and their warning letters made it clear they viewed me as a target, not a member of the community. The day of the trial was tense. I sat on the witness stand and described the harassment, the damage to my property, and the emotional toll of feeling unsafe in my own home. My lawyer played the security footage for the court, letting the images speak for themselves. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone watched the officers destroy my fence, shatter my window, and spray paint my house. The HOA leadership tried to distance themselves from the officers' actions, claiming they hadn't sanctioned the vandalism. But under cross-examination, cracks in their story began to show. Emails and meeting notes revealed that they had, in fact, encouraged the officers to enforce their standards, even if it meant being aggressive. By the end of the day, the judge was visibly unimpressed with their excuses. The court ruled decisively in my favor. The HOA was found guilty of harassment, trespassing, and property damage. The judge ordered them to pay me $300,000 in restitution, dismantle their officers' team permanently, and cease all further harassment of residents. The fallout was immediate. The HOA's reputation was in shambles. Leadership resigned en masse, and many members withdrew their support entirely. The organization that had once wielded so much power over the neighborhood was now barely holding on, its influence all but gone. The legal victory should have felt like a new beginning. I should have been celebrating, basking in the relief of finally having my day in court and seeing those who wronged me held accountable. But instead, the house no longer felt like home. It wasn't just the physical damage. They'd taken something deeper from me. I had fought for my home, but now I needed to find a place where I could finally find peace again, where I didn't have to carry the scars of the past every time I sat on the porch or looked out the window. I needed a fresh start, a place where my independence wasn't a point of contention but a given. So I made the decision. I would sell the house. It wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about moving on from the emotional toll the whole situation had taken on me. I listed the house for sale the next week. The process was swift, surprisingly so. The restitution money from the lawsuit, along with the sale proceeds, gave me more than enough to make the move. I was tired of fighting, tired of holding on to a place that no longer felt like mine. The buyer was a young couple, eager to start their own life in a house they could fix up. I could see the excitement in their eyes when they walked through, and I knew it was time to let go. There were no tears, no emotional goodbyes. I'd fought the battle, and now it was time to move on. I signed the papers, handed over the keys, and walked away. I needed to find somewhere far from the shadow of past conflicts, far from the place that had become synonymous with frustration. I moved to a small, mid-sized town, tucked away in a rural area where the streets were wide, and the houses sat on spacious plots. No more rules or arbitrary oversight, just people who valued their independence as much as I did. I bought a modest 3-bedroom house with a large garage, far from the watchful eyes of anyone. It was a fixer-upper, but it was mine. No one cared how I painted my shutters or whether my grass was a few inches over the acceptable length. Felt like freedom. As I unpacked, I took my time settling in. There was no rush, no one pushing me to act. The days felt longer, more relaxed, and I found myself enjoying simple things again. The quiet walks down the street, the the sound of birds in the trees. I wasn't worried about what the neighbors thought. I wasn't worried about any rules. The garage became my retreat once again. I set up a woodworking shop in the far corner of the garage, a project I had always dreamed of but never had the time for. The space was simple, just a workbench, a few power tools, and shelves stocked with lumber, but it felt like a blank canvas. There was something incredibly satisfying about crafting furniture, small items for the house, shelves, a chair, a coffee table. Each piece I created felt like it had a part of me in it, something I had made with my own hands. It was freedom in its purest form. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed it, how much I'd craved it, until I was elbow-deep in wood and paint, focused on the simple joy of creation. To top it off, I decided to take a part-time job at the local hardware store. It wasn't much, just a way to stay active and engaged with the community. But it was enough. There was something comforting about the steady rhythm of small-town life. The store wasn't busy all the time, but when it was, I enjoyed helping out. I felt connected to the people who lived in this town. The faces were familiar, friendly, and I wasn't judged for being independent or for having my own opinions. I appreciated that simplicity. I appreciated that I didn't have to explain myself to anyone. There was no pressure to conform to anyone's expectations. I wasn't the guy who fought the system anymore. I was just Carl, a regular guy helping out around town, living his life on his own terms. I made a few friends in town. Some of them veterans like me, others just good, hard-working folks who didn't have time for drama. I could tell right away who was genuine and who wasn't. An elderly couple down the street, for instance, they had been here longer than anyone. They were quiet, no-nonsense people who didn't care about politics or what anyone else was doing. It was easy, comfortable. It reminded me of something I had forgotten, a sense of community that wasn't about obligation or expectation, but simply about being present. We drank coffee, we shared stories, and the evening passed in the kind of calm that felt like the world was finally at peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt at home, not just in the house, but in my own skin again. The tension I had been carrying for so long slowly started to melt away. I could finally relax, knowing that no one was waiting for me to slip up. No one was going to come knocking on my door with another complaint or threat. I was free, really free. And it wasn't just about having space or privacy. It was about having a place where I could just exist, no strings attached.